This is The Other Side with Damian Coury.
G'day and welcome to episode 11 of The Other Side Australia for the week of Friday, November 6th. The week my dad turned 90 and going strong. Good on you, Dad. And this is our US and Queensland election wrap-up special. We'll try to make sense of it all for you as Ray Radowski joins me for a wrap of the first 48 hours of commentary from the US. This is going to be a pretty feisty chat, I think, between Ray and I. Alexandra Marshall will join me with her report from the Conservative Political Action Conference in Sydney. That's the annual gab fest of conservatives and classical liberals and libertarians that the control left tried to shut down last year. Labor attention seeker Christina Keneally thinks she's the only one entitled to shove her views down our throats. You may recall her attempt last year to put the brakes on Nigel Farage coming in for the conference. Viva la Freedom Australia, way to go. This year there were some interesting things said about how the left the Liberal Party seems to be moving and how that's not working out for them. Speaking of which, we will have our full wrap and post-mortem on the Queensland election loss for the right and the big win for the left. And that a lot of lessons for the rest of Australia in that. So that's coming up later on in the show. Do stay tuned for that one. Let's get into it on the US election with Ray. Joining me now, Ray Radowski, our North America expert. Ray, what a week. I'm not feeling good as a classical liberal / sort of sometimes conservative / libertarian leaning kind of guy. This is a bad week for me. The Queensland election, I'm a Queenslander, and now Trump. I'm a little depressed.
Fear not. This is not the end of something. It's just the beginning of a major fight that will lead, I think, eventually to a lot more of the reforms that Trump was talking about in terms of how this election was being put together and how the lack of transparency has led to the situation that we're in. There's a great, I think it's the masthead for the Washington Post, which is "Democracy Dies in Darkness."
Yeah.
And I think that that's the headline today, because when you see a situation where Trump is up significantly in all the states that he needs to win, and then suddenly, in the dark, these ballots show up in key states and suddenly they start flipping. It's all according to the script that was put forward in the narrative that the media was spinning before this election to try to make Trump into this guy who lost, was a sore loser, and refused to leave the White House.
Okay, I don't agree. I went to bed last night with Trump miles. I did a video. I put a video up basically saying, look, this is why Trump's got this in the bag. I went through the numbers. He had these margins in a lot of these battleground states. I woke up this morning and these margins have contracted significantly. Biden's now definitely got Wisconsin and Michigan, which with Nevada, which he's almost certainly got, and Arizona, which he's almost certainly got, is going to get him over the line, even if Trump gets Pennsylvania, Georgia, and North Carolina. So these are the states that are in play to get to 270. There are basically 4 in play as we speak, Ray, and we are recording Australian time at about 6:30 p.m. on Thursday night. So Joe's on 264. He's just got to get Nevada, which is 6. That takes him to 270, and it's game over.
But this is banking on the idea that Wisconsin is in the Biden camp, and that is still far from being decided.
Well, it's not. I mean, the numbers now, Wisconsin's been called. It's 99%. Wisconsin is 99% counted. Biden is on 1,630,542, and Trump's on 1,610,000. So there's a 20,000 vote gap. You got 1% of the vote left to count, which is 30,000 votes. That's not
sort of margin, that razor thin margin warrants a recount. And so in these situations, when ballots show up in the middle of the night without any adult supervision, after the counting somehow stops, and there's no explanation for why that counting was ordered to be stopped, just at the moment where it looked like Trump was going to declare victory.
Okay, well, let's go look at last night's numbers on Wisconsin. We're talking Wisconsin, right? So let's look at last night's numbers. Okay, last night, when I went to bed, there was 83% counted. Biden 1,420,000, Trump 1,529,000. So Trump was ahead by 109,000, and we woke up this morning and he's behind by 20,000. And there were, at that stage last night, only about 600,000 votes to count. That's a pretty good swing to Biden. But Ray, the reason for this is these late votes are the ones that are being counted from the pre-poll, from the mail-ins, and they lean to Biden. It's as simple as that.
But isn't it a little suspicious that these trenches of ballots come in and they're 100% unanimous for one candidate? If that was in favor of Trump, there would be a huge outpouring of outrage in the streets.
These guys, they've got scrutineers in there. I mean, the counting's happening.
This is the point of this whole story is you've got to go state by state and precinct by precinct. But there have been allegations and evidence of various irregularities. Irregularity equals voter fraud, by the way. So these things need to be ironed out, not in the streets, but in the courts, so that there's a clear path to understanding how the votes can be counted and all the legal votes can be assessed in an orderly way. And that hasn't happened yet.
You're absolutely right. This can't go into the streets. Put down your weapons. I saw someone tweeting today, it's time to lock and load. No, it is not. Especially for the right. If we want to give the other side ammunition to attack us with on the center right and the right, we just need to get the far right out there going nuts. We do not need that, guys. Let Antifa and BLM and the left-wing lunatics do all of that, and let's not engage with that. Let's be dignified. Let's take this through the court process. Let's do it the right way.
It's very hard to believe that a candidate who didn't actively campaign in major states versus the president who was attracting, even in his last days of campaigning, crowds of up to 25,000. There is no way that with a media telling you that the polls were saying Biden was double digit ahead of Trump, that it could be this close. Like, this is just ridiculous. And so for this to even happen warrants greater scrutiny. Seriously.
All right. Well, we're going to bring you a range of commentators. Let's listen to Steve Bannon, former chief of staff for Donald Trump, co-founder of Breitbart News with Andrew Breitbart, the right-wing news site. What essentially is Bannon saying, Ray?
Bannon is basically gathering forces together to stand united in opposition and saying, this is nonsense. This is outrageous. Trump won, and a proper vote count will bear that out.
Let's have a listen to Steve Bannon.
It is incumbent upon us today to take dramatic and bold action. That's got to start at the top. The people around him that are nervous, the people around him that don't want to, upset the media. This is the deciding moment now. This is the inflection point.
And that's Steve Bannon. Ray, I'm still not sold on this whole narrative that there's been some sort of tampering going on. Can you just take me through? How do you think that's happened? Why do you think that's happened?
We saw this in the lead up to the vote with various scenarios and situations and stories that weren't widely reported of ballots being found in various states of the trash. Also, there were various kind of scenarios played out by Democrat groups in which this situation was forecast as well. So they've prepared for this.
But so is Trump. But so did Trump. So did the Republicans. The Republicans have been setting up this narrative for ages.
They've been preparing for this scenario. I don't know that they've set up the narrative.
Trump was putting out the story that I'm going to lose this election
because of voter fraud. Behind the scenes chicanery that's going on.
Right.
And this is one of the trust your eyes. You've got a situation where
we've got scrutineers. The scrutineers are in there. Both parties have got scrutineers in the polling booths, like we have in Australia, checking as the counts are going on, don't they?
No one has properly explained why the vote counting was suddenly stopped. That I don't think has ever happened. And then in the state of Wisconsin, suddenly these ballots are dropped off at 4:30 in the morning and just happen to be the right amount unanimously in favor of Joe Biden to tip him over the edge.
Where did they come from?
State. I don't know. That hasn't been properly reported.
Didn't they come from one of the? Wouldn't the scrutineers know? Isn't there a process? Wouldn't they have come from one of the city
It's
city,
interesting that the
urban.
media, there doesn't seem to be a proper narrative of where this stuff is coming from.
But there
And
doesn't seem to
because
be a
of
proper
lack of-
narrative that there's anything really wrong happening either. And I don't think we can jump to the conclusion of some bizarre conspiracy if or some bizarre interference.
But I don't think it's a conspiracy, and I don't think it's a bizarre interference. I think there are some serious questions about how it is that on election night, Trump can have very large margins in key states with almost 80 or percent calling it. And then suddenly within 4 or 5 hours, it all flips around. That doesn't make any sense.
Let's look at Michigan.
As they say, the optics are bad. And when the optics are this bad, the whole system and the trust in that system comes into disarray.
And that's the scary thing.
This. The outcome of this election isn't the story. It's the future and the trust in the system that produced that outcome that's now at stake. And that's why I think you're not seeing the Democrats doing the Macarena and celebrating. They're very cautious because they know how bad this looks. And I don't think that any party, any president would want to assume power under this sort of set of circumstances. In the past, there have been close elections, absolutely. But it hasn't been in a situation where it's going one way and then suddenly there's this inexplicable pause and then suddenly it goes the other way.
It needs to go to court. It needs a proper investigation. We need to understand what's happening.
Scrutiny to understand the chain of capture of these ballots from the actual voting to the actual count, and then what is a valid ballot. And you've got this situation again, the longer that they extend the count, the more there's the possibility of introducing things from an external source into it. And so I think there's a big fear that by having ballots that aren't postmarked with the date of the election come in, to have situations where signatures don't have to match, to have other sort of so-called irregularities allowed, then you get a situation where if that's what happens in this situation, what's the future of the entire electoral system? And then remember that the United States is a beacon of democracy for the rest of the world. So if they're having this situation, which is very much like what you see in countries like Belarus and elsewhere, where these people come to power and you've got like more votes than people living in the state, that's a big problem and it needs further scrutiny. And I think that the entire trust of the election and the process of that election is at stake in this situation.
I saw a meme this week where it was a bunch of Iraqi vote scrutineers sitting in the photo, and it said, Iraq's sending election observers to the United States to help out in their transition to good democracy. All right, so let's have a look at Michigan. When I went to bed, Trump was on 2.167 million. Biden was on 1.858 million. 72% had been counted. There was 1.6 million votes to be counted. And Biden would have had to have won 950,000 of those 1.6 million to catch up to Trump, which just didn't seem feasible. I woke up, Australia time, Michigan. Biden is leading 2.637, Trump 2.599. Now it's 2.751 and 2.631. So Biden is now 100,000 votes ahead. He's up by 900,000 votes on last night, and there was only 1.6 million votes to count.
And these are all absentee and postal ballots, and then boxes that have been laying
and
here,
city
there, and
boxes, urban boxes.
Right.
I mean, that is possible to get that sort of a swing, but it's unusual.
It's interesting to hear the commenters looking at it. I mean, this is a country that put a man on the moon. It's the country where Microsoft exists and every other major technology, and yet you have a situation where you can't count ballots in a timely manner.
I mean, I don't know how it is in Canada. I don't know how it is in Canada for you guys, but in Australia, we have the Australian Electoral Commission. They supervise everything. In America, just so people understand at home, it is not like that. Every state is very independent. They do it their own way. The only connection with the feds is when they say, here's our electoral college votes. Our state has 3 votes and here's where they're going. That's it. And
it's a very politicized system. In all of these situations, you've got Democrat governors in
Okay, that's what I
states
wanted to
that,
ask you. So Wisconsin and Michigan are both Democrat governors, is that right?
correct, yes.
Okay, all right. And Pennsylvania?
Yes.
Okay. And this is where Trump thinks there's been a bit of
There's
fiddly-diddly.
look, as we say in a lot of these stories, the optics are bad. Who wants to live in a country where the president didn't actively campaign, wasn't really clued into what was going on, had this ethics scandal stemming back to when he was vice president, and now suddenly, like, he's the guy? It just people will not accept that.
I hear. It needs to go to court. We need transparency around all of this. There needs to be an investigation. Yep. All right, Ray. Well, let's take a quick break. We will come back in a moment with Ray Rudowski, our North America expert, to continue our conversation about the aftermath of the US election, and we'll move away from the count and into other issues right after the break. And don't forget, coming up shortly, we'll have Alexandra Marshall's report on the CPAC conference, the Conservative Gabfest down in Sydney, which has just wrapped up. And also, we will, later on in the show, have my report and review of the Queensland state election, which has some very serious implications and lessons for the whole nation. Stay with us. You're listening to The Other Side Australia, your weekly shortcut to Australia's best commentary from a sensible centre-right perspective. The best way to support the podcast is to tell your friends about it and share it on social media. If you'd like to support us financially, go to subscribestar.com. That's subscribestar.com and simply search up The Other Side Australia. And it's time to continue with our coverage of the aftermath of the US presidential election. Our North America expert, Ray Rudowski, is with me to discuss all that's going on. Ray, we've decided to just move a little bit away from the count for a little moment and focus on a few other issues. One thing that everybody's concerned about is, do you think that there's going to be, as we wait for these results, if it goes on for weeks and months, is there going to be some kind of violence and unrest?
Absolutely. I think that there's going to be clashes in the streets, and this is already planned for. We've seen this in the last election results in 2016, that there were suddenly these spontaneous riots that broke out. You've got all these groups that are camping out in various cities. You've got the National Guard being called out in various states. You've got a lot of stores that are boarding up. And who are they preparing for? It's not, and it hasn't been, Trump supporters typically that go out and loot and destroy things.
No, that's exactly right. I heard an ABC commentator in Brisbane the other day saying they're building a fence around the White House and he's supposed to be the leader of the free world. And I thought, yes, who are they building the fence for? They're building it for the left and how the left are going to react when he wins. That's what they were building it for. One other thing I want to touch on, Ray, the demographics are really interesting because here's a man who is constantly called a homophobic, a racist, a sexist. Mm-hmm. The gay vote went up for Trump enormously. Mm-hmm. The black vote doubled from 9% to 18%, and it was male and female. So 3 strikes, you're out on the homophobic, racist, sexist guy. But we knew that because that's identity politics, critical theory garbage coming from the left. So Trump isn't racist, sexist, and homophobic, as we well know, and people can see through it. And that black vote swing was something we really did expect. The demographic that he went down most in, guess what it was? White males.
I think that you've got a situation now with Trump where it's no longer about identity politics. It's about economic nationalism. People are voting with their wallets in terms of how is this going to affect me. Law and order is a huge thing. Opening up the economy, these were all situations where the Biden campaign was really pushing back. They wanted to keep the country closed down. They had all these radical economic policies. It just doesn't make any sense. And that's why these election results need to come under greater scrutiny, because you've got these huge Trump rallies versus somebody who didn't campaign, who couldn't generate any voter enthusiasm, and suddenly these bags of votes are showing up, and they just happen to be unanimously for the candidate, Joe Biden.
The pollsters couldn't have been more wrong. Trump nearly won. Trump was not supposed to nearly win, was he? Will we ever have faith in the polls again?
I think that the polling industry needs to take a second look at itself, because clearly there's either some sort of manipulation going on, their standards and practices aren't up to scratch, or they're clearly trying to drive a narrative in the public's mind that a certain candidate has a certain advantage over another candidate. And then when they suddenly win on game day, on the voting day, it doesn't make sense. So obviously it has to be that there's these votes that exist somewhere in the ether and need to be counted.
I often say in Australia that if you don't think Trump is a buffoon, you must be insane, because all you get in the Australian media is the negative of Trump. I mean, if you did I think it was 90% negative coverage in the United States. Is that right? If you did it in Australia, it'd be 100%, practically 99.999. Nobody could survive that. The fact that he even almost won, given that sort of negative, and in PR, as you and I know, you can measure these things. They do share of voice analyses, and it's coming back. You measure for tone, whether it's negative or positive, the coverage. And he's getting like 90% negative coverage in America, and probably 100 here.
You say he almost won. It's not over. It's far from over. It's far from over. It's only just starting. And you've got a situation where this is not Joe Biden was critical of the fact that he was getting heckled at his rallies, versus Trump, who's been attacked on every front. He's been impeached. He's had to undergo this scrutiny that no other president in at least my lifetime has ever gone through. And
I thought conservative commentator Ben Shapiro was pretty good on this. I want to just play a little clip of Ben speaking just a few moments ago about that very point.
It's not a massive victory by any stretch of the imagination for Joe Biden, even in the popular vote. That dude was expected to win by 7 percentage points. Instead, if he does win, he's going to end up winning by 2. Okay, that is nowhere near the kind of margin he was supposed to win by. He ran a lackluster garbage campaign. He's a lackluster garbage candidate. Everybody knows it. The only reason he won, if he indeed ends up winning, is because the media put their thumb and their elbow and their entire body weight on the scale against Donald Trump, and he was able to run headlong away from any difficult questions the entirety of the campaign. If Donald Trump ends up not being the president of the United States, the number one factor in him not being president of the United States will have been the media, which militarized to their fullest extent on behalf of Joe Biden. But this thing ain't over yet. It is not over yet, even though everybody is trying to declare it over yet. My favorite part of this is that Joe Biden then declared the presidency is not a partisan institution. Yeah, we're going to get bipartisan Joe after campaigning on wokeness and how half of Americans are terrible, awful, no good, very bad people. Now he's going to be the president for all Americans. Yeah, good luck with that, Joe.
To make progress, we have to stop treating our opponents as enemies. We are not enemies. What brings us together as Americans is so much stronger than anything that can tear us apart. So let me be clear. We are campaigning as a Democrat, but I will govern as an American president.
Okay, he was only VP under the most viciously partisan president of my lifetime. Yes, that is true. Barack Obama was more of a vicious partisan than Donald Trump. Donald Trump actually signed into law bills with bipartisan support. Okay, so spare me the histrionics about how Joe Biden is a great unifier. He is not.
So that's Ben Shapiro. Another thing, Ray, is that people tend to forget that Trump is not the cause of the disunity in the United States. Trump is the result of the disunity in the United States. And the Tea Party movement, the conservative groundswell in reaction to critical theory, identity politics, garbage, the Tea Party emerged 10, 15 years before Trump. It was a grassroots, community-based sort of thing with, fairly ordinary mainstream conservatives, obviously mainly outside New York and California, but middle America, ordinary people, just getting together for tea parties and saying, we've got to do something. We've got to fix the country. That's not going to suddenly disappear just because Biden's won the election. Oh, we got rid of Trump, the left says. Hooray, everything's going to go back to normal. No, it's not.
It's not going to go back to normal. You're going to have a very divided electorate. You're going to have a lot more fear. You're going to have chaos. You're going to have uncertainty. It's going to be like Brazil, where you've got this big, massive country that just can't seem to get its stuff together anymore.
So Joe Biden
rich in resources, but just completely corrupt and petty and not really moving or punching beyond its weight economically or otherwise.
The more I see of him, the more I buy into the idea that Joe's not well. Now, I would firmly believe if Joe Biden wins this week or wins when the courts have done their work, I don't think he's going to be president for very long. I think we've elected Kamala Harris here.
That's right. And again, her views have kind of evolved where she was very hard on crime. And now she's talking about disbanding the police or defunding the police in various situations. She's like for decriminalization of marijuana when she put people away when she was Solicitor General in California. Put people away for those.
Yeah, she's got this social conservative side to her.
All over the place.
Yeah,
and the problem in this situation is we don't really know who she is because the media never scrutinized her in the same way that they scrutinized Trump and Pence. Even with the advent of this Hunter Biden laptop scandal and influence peddling, there was really no scrutiny of who these two people were, what their records were. They were never challenged.
Ray, I just want to touch on a couple other things before we wrap up, which is the Senate and the House. So the Senate, I understand the Democrats, it's going to be very tough for them to win the Senate. Looks as though the Republicans will still hold that Senate. House of Representatives, no chance for the Republicans to win there. We've got 44 seats left undecided, just so Australians understand. The House of Representatives is the same as ours, but the leader doesn't become the prime minister or the president. The leader is becomes the House Speaker, the leader of the majority party in the House of Representatives. So it's separate to the executive, whereas in our system, they form the executive. So the 435 seat House, you need 218 to win. Democrats are at 203 at the moment. Republicans 188, 44 still undecided. Slight chance that the Republicans. This wasn't supposed to happen. Nancy Pelosi, who's the House Speaker, the Democrat majority leader, she said, we are going to pick up more seats on our 203. The Republicans have picked up 5 to 12 seats already, and there's still 44 to go. And they've added 12 women. 12 women. So an amazing job from the Republicans in the House.
It's impossible to have that sort of result and then think that Joe Biden could possibly be president with those razor-thin margins after he was supposedly so far ahead, according to the media polls and the media.
Just one more thing we've got to cover before we wrap up. I think it's the only thing that we've left out. We'd like to cover everything and sort of give you a snapshot of everything.
Did we leave something out of this discussion? Okay.
We did. We haven't talked about the dreaded popular vote yet. Joe won the popular vote. I think back in 2016, Hillary had about 67 million, Trump 64 million. More people turned out this time. Trump got about 67 million and Biden's sitting around 70 million. But it's completely natural and normal for the popular vote to have that sort of a gap because the electoral college system is designed to balance out the fact that there is a massive population in California and a massive population in New York. And if we didn't have the electoral college system, you wouldn't have anybody ever being elected without who couldn't win those two states. So just on the popular vote thing, do you think that's going to support Biden's argument for legitimacy?
The popular vote, I think, is significant only in the idea of a moral victory or a mandate. So when a president wins by a majority in the Electoral College, but a minority in the popular vote, he's still the president. But there's always this question of, does he have enough support out there among the populace? But with this election and the results already in question and all this lawfare going on, I'm going to reserve judgment on the popular vote until the final tallies are in.
Yeah, you're not even sure there is a 3 million gap. We'll leave it there, my friend, and we will be watching the story, and I'm sure talking about it for many weeks to come. Let's pray for peace and hope that they get this sorted out through the courts the right way. Ray Radowski, thanks for joining us.
Keep a song in your heart.
This is The Other Side with Damien Curry, a new podcast for the quiet Australians. Tell your friends to subscribe on Apple, Spotify, Google, YouTube, and all major podcast platforms.
Oh, that was a pretty tough little session with Ray there. Joining me now is the Queen of Conservative and Libertarian Twitter in Australia, Alexandra Marshall. Alexandra, welcome. The Conservative Political Action Conference was held to coincide with the election in the US in Sydney. Tell us a little bit about what CPAC actually is.
Oh, well, what a wonderful thing CPAC is. It's run, of course, by Andrew Cooper, who is in charge of Liberty Works and who is the co-founder of CPAC Australia. Basically, what it is, it's an idea borrowed from America, and it's a big day of partying and speeches and a social get-together for conservatives across Australia, and we often have guests from overseas. So last year we had the likes of Nigel Farage, and we had a lot of American guests like Matt Schlapp. This year, of course, was COVID, so we had to have just Australian guests, and even to the point where it was mostly just those who were in New South Wales. And as the day wore on, we all became pretty sure that Trump was going to win, so the party intensified and everyone got a bit riled up. And then toward the evening, it got a little bit uncertain, as I'm sure you've already discussed earlier, that we're getting a little bit, no one's really quite sure what's going to happen now. But at CPAC, we thought he was winning, so it was great. We were all excited.
Well, I thought he was winning last night too, to the point where I put a video out saying as much, and then woke up this morning and had to kind of, we're winding that one back now, and I've had my PVO moment.
There's a lot of winding back tweets on Twitter at the moment. People are like, just kidding about that. Yeah.
Oops. Well, Ray insists it's not over till it's over, so we will see what's going to happen in the next few weeks. So, who were the speakers this year? Given that we had local speakers, you mentioned a couple.
So we had the Old Outsiders crew back together again. That's the Sky News Outsiders. So we had Rowan Dean, Ross Cameron, and Mark Latham. And Mark in particular was the last speaker of the day, and he was hysterical.
He's funny. Yeah, he is very funny.
Very funny. And then we had Alan Jones for the first time this year, and he did both a panel with some of our Liberal senators, Warren Mundine, who was dispelling some of the myths about Black Lives Matter. We had Bettina Arndt. We had the guys from the IPA. We had Tom Switzer. We had Craig Kelly, who was in outstanding form. I think he's really enjoying his role as a counterculture warrior.
Oh, yes, Craig Kelly, the federal Liberal Party member for Hughes. Alexandra, what was the big topic this year? What was the conversation focused on?
It was very much centered around the rise of Marxism. And, of course, everyone is looking at the US with great concern about what the Democrats are talking about. And because Australia tends to copy and paste a lot of its culture and politics from America, a lot of the speakers were definitely discussing what problems Australia might have, whether the Democrats win or lose. And one of the concerns was that if the Democrats win, which it looks like they might, we're not quite sure, what that means for the likes of Scott Morrison and the Liberal Party, who have been quite rightly accused of moving toward the left and in taking this idea of the broad church a little bit too far, where they are becoming a weak political force that is losing elections, as you saw in Queensland last week. So that was one of the main topics that was new this year.
Queensland election wrap is coming up in a moment, by the way, so I can't talk about it too much because I start to get a little emotional. It's been a tough week there. Yeah.
You should have given me a trigger warning so that I knew not to talk about that for you. But we also, of course, we have a lot of fun. So it's a social event. So we have drinks and we have a morning social and an evening social. And then we do this great thing called the Keneally Cup, which was meant to be the Freedom Award. But last year, of course...
Named after?
Christina Keneally, yes. She came out and she tried to ban CPAC last year. And in doing so, because Nigel Farage was coming out and Raheem Kassam, and she wanted to stop them from entering the country, and all that happened was everyone bought tickets to CPAC. And this year, if we hadn't have had COVID restricting our numbers, it would have been huge. There would have been over 1,000 people there this year, but we had to turn people away because, restrictions in New South Wales, you can't have huge gatherings like that.
I simply cannot stand Christina Keneally. Let me just put it on the record, right? Now, I will tolerate Christina Keneally, anything she wants to say, any forum she wants to go to, anywhere she wants to speak. I will defend her right to speak, even though I can't stand a single thought that goes through her, in my opinion, spacious brain. But how she could possibly have thought it was a good idea to try to have Nigel Farage banned from entering Australia to speak at a conference. What sort of signal does that send about our tolerance for... this is what bugs me about the critical theory identity politics left. It's diversity in everything. The one area where we should have diversity is diversity of opinion. And
Christina Keneally forgot that she was less popular than Nigel Farage.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so,
well, it backfired on her anyway, didn't it?
Were there any chief marketing organisation? So that's why we named it after her, because she basically sold out the whole show. And don't forget, Christina Keneally is famous for failing her way into power. So Fu and I used to joke that she's going to end up failing her way to the prime ministership, which may happen. Stay tuned.
Oh, don't scare me. It's like Joe Biden.
And we gave the cup to Daniel Andrews and the state of China, the southern state of China, which is Danistan. So he got the cup this year, the Freedom Award, which we thought was fun. He got great cheers for that. And so of course we had a huge protest last year. It was in the news. There was one lonely little Antifa protester standing outside our place this time. And I worked out how we managed to escape protest, because last time it was organised by the university professors. And of course, this year the universities are all closed. And so it seems are the protesters. So if you want to get rid of Marxism, just close the universities. It works great.
And half of the ABC while you're at it.
Oh, well, that would probably help as well.
You mentioned this thing about, the concern among conservatives in Australia about the fact that we're seeing what is supposed to be the Conservative Party shifting more centre, and even in some cases centre-left.
So this is not just a this year trend. This has been going on for a while inside conservative audiences across the country. There is concern that the Liberal Party and to some extent the National Party are chasing Labor's tail toward the far left spectrum of the Greens ideology. And so when people like Matt Keane and Gladys Berejiklian and the whole Photius group, and even to an extent Scott Morrison, were mentioned on the stage, they would get booed, which is an extraordinary thing. I mean, that would be like Trump getting booed at a CPAC conference. It wouldn't happen. But over here in Australia, conservative politics is so far removed from its actual blue ribbon base that there is a disconnect between the voters and the leaders of the party. Now, the voters haven't changed their position. Everyone I spoke to is still where they were 20 years ago. It's the party itself which has been moving left. And if you look at someone like, as you say, Matt Keane, he's basically a Green. And this is the idea of that liberal broad church, which has resulted in people who should be in the Labor Party sitting in the Liberals in safe blue ribbon seats. And so there's nothing anyone can do about it. And as there's more and more and more of them, the party has changed its appearance, which is a worry for the future of conservative politics. And so part of this big CPAC forum is bringing together the conservative ideas and, bringing everyone together to see what the conservative movement actually looks like in Australia now, and trying to reconnect politicians with their audience and with their base.
Doesn't the fact that the political spectrum or the politicians are moving to the left suggest that the political spectrum is moving to the left because they're responding to it? Politics is downstream of culture, as they say, that our culture is actually has actually shifted, and that the Queensland election and the US elections would tend to bear that out, that we're maybe losing the culture war a little bit?
Well, no, this is very similar to what the world looked like at the beginning of the 1900s. So everyone, like even Australia, I'll keep it light, even Australia was moving toward socialism and communism. We had very left-wing politicians, and it was on the edge there. And it was a knife edge for a while where it looked like we might become just like the other socialist countries across the world. And it didn't represent the people so much. It represented the politicians being enchanted by a global movement, which they thought was a sort of utopia. And the problem that the people have is when both sides of the politicians start listening to a very small media organisation or press gallery, which is what happened last time, they all start following each other. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the people agree. And this is why you have parties in the UK like the Reclaim Party and like Brexit popping up all over the place because the political spectrum doesn't actually tend to move. It's been stable for thousands of years. There's always been traditionalists, and then there's been a sort of counterculture. That's never really changed. But political parties move up and down. As they shift along the spectrum, new parties pop up to replace them. So what Liberals have to be really careful of, and has happened in the past to the Liberal Party, is that other parties pop up and take their place if they abandon their base. So as we saw in Queensland, they refuse to be conservative. And so if people are offered the choice between Labor and Labor Light, they will tend to choose the full-blown Labor.
Well, especially in a crisis, they're going to go with what they're comfortable with and what they know. If you're not offering some sort of clear differentiation, you're not going to get elected.
Yeah, you have to stand up and be strong about your values and offer a real choice. And every time in Australia's history where a Conservative Party has done that, it has absolutely stormed home in an election.
Yeah. And because Australians like that. That's a core Australian value, is to step up and take the lead and be strong and not be pushed around. And we don't like weak leaders. That's the reality of it. And so, when Anastasia Palaszczuk started to get criticised and pushed around a bit, she just stuck her chin out and took it on the chin as a kind of way to demonstrate her strength. And then that played really well for her. Do you think a new Conservative Party will emerge? I mean, we saw Cory Bernardi's party didn't really get off the ground. One Nation's tanked in the Queensland election. We need a Conservative Party that isn't tainted with, a bit of a racist brush or a negative connotation from the past. We need a new, fresh, kind of sensible party, don't we?
What I actually think will happen in Australia, so it's a bit different in the UK. What happens in the UK may be slightly different, but in Australia, I suspect that the Liberals will get wiped out. If they keep going left, they're eventually going to get wiped out in an election. And when that happens, all the people who are basically rent-sinking in the safe Liberal seats who are not Liberal will abandon the party. And the party will have to look back toward itself and find some real talent and go back to its base in order to regain an election. At that point, you will find conservative politics strengthening, and that, don't forget, that'll be in 4 or 5 years, by which point we'll have seen how badly socialism fails and how the devastating results of just giving free stuff away continuously and cuddling up to the UN and all its policies. They'll have had time to manifest by that point, and I think it'll be time for the Conservative Party to return to a more John Howard era of leadership. So that's what I think will happen in Australia. It just, for some reason, I don't know why, doesn't matter how much history we have access to, human beings always want to do politics the hard way. And so we will be stuck doing it the hard way, which is a real shame because you and I are going to have to live through it. But, and don't forget, CPAC was nearly cancelled because our Liberal Conservative government went after Andrew Cooper for the foreign interference legislation because he dared to invite Americans and Nigel Farage. Don't forget about that.
That was last year?
Yes, but it was ongoing. He's got another court hearing in a couple of months to clear it all up.
For what?
Well, so you know how they invented that foreign interference legislation, presumably to deal with China.
Right.
So all that happened is the shadow attorney general managed to convince the attorney general and the team of public servants to issue Andrew Cooper with a threatening letter about, hand over everything or you'll be going to jail, et cetera, et cetera. And so he had to drum up support to take the government to court over the Foreign Interference Act, as if somehow running a Conservative conference was an act of foreign interference against Australia.
It's bizarre.
And that,
God.
I mean,
free speech is definitely under threat, isn't it?
You forget about Christina Keneally. The greatest threat to free speech is apparently the Liberal government.
Yeah. Okay. This is not making me happy. This is not making me happy, Alexandra. It's been a hard week.
It makes you happy. The party was great, and next year you should come. It was a fabulous get together and just a big party. It was wonderful.
Yeah, definitely be there next year. I'm sure our border will be open and we might even be able to go to our another part of our own country. Alexandra Marshall, wonderful as always to talk to you. Thank you very, very much. And we will catch up again next week and see just where the landscape lies for the United States and Australia and the world in terms of liberty. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
Coming up next, I will take a look at the Queensland state election. How did we lose? I'll give you a nice summary of the best commentary of the week on that one.
You're listening to The Other Side with Damien Curry. Not the sort of show you'd hear on the ABC. And we're not forcing you to pay for it either.
Well, hasn't it been a horrible week for classical liberalism and conservatism? In Australia, we saw a bigger defeat than expected for the LNP in the Queensland state election. Queensland's parliament has 93 seats. There's no upper house in Queensland, so it's what's called a unicameral parliament, just one house, the House of Representatives, or the Legislative Assembly, as it's called. The Labor Party had 48 seats of those 93 going into this election. The LNP had 39, and the Qatar Australia Party had 3. One Nation and the Greens had 1 seat each, and there was 1 independent. It was expected that the Labor Party would lose a few seats and there'd be a swing against it. But far from losing any seats, Labor now has 50 seats, the LNP just 32 confirmed, Qatar holds on to their 3, One Nation has 1, and the Greens now have 2, thanks to the demise of Labor's former deputy Jackie Trad, who lost the very lefty inner-city South Brisbane electorate to the Green candidate. And there's still 1 independent. There are 4 seats in doubt. All of them were LNP-held seats that Labor has taken away most of the margin. But it is predicted that the LNP will hang on to 3 of those, and that will end up with the ALP on 51 and the LNP on 35. Only 4 seats changed hands. Labor took 3 from the LNP, and the Greens took 1 from Labor.
And I know that during this election, there are many people out there in Queensland who have voted Labor for the very first time. I thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I will return that respect every single day.
That's Anastasia Palaszczuk during her victory speech on election night.
Queensland is the best place on earth, and it is the best state in Australia. And Queenslanders are tough, but I also know that we need to have a strong recovery plan. This has been a tough year and we've got to get people back into work. And I give my commitment to the people of this state that my team, we will roll up our sleeves and we will get back to work as quickly as possible for you.
On primary vote, Labor got 40%, with a swing of 4.6% to it. The LNP got just 35.7% with a swing of 2% to it. But that's lower than Campbell Newman's 41.3% in 2015, when he lost office as Premier in what was considered a big disaster for the LNP. The Greens got 9.3% of the popular vote, with a swing away from it of 0.7%. That's good news. The Greens were polling as high as 12% statewide and 16% in Brisbane, but they only got 9.3% and went backwards a bit despite their win in South Brisbane. One Nation got 7.1% of the vote. It crashed down 6.7% on last time. But this means that most of that swing from One Nation went to Labor, not to the Conservative LNP. The most insightful analysis this week came, unsurprisingly, from the man with first-hand experience of both running the state and the machinations of the LNP itself. Queensland's only non-Labor Premier for the past 22 years, Campbell Newman. He led the state from 2012 to 15. Newman told Alan Jones' program on Sky News this week that while COVID-19 was a factor in the election, it cannot be used as an excuse by the party room.
The problem was there were 3 years in which to make the case against the government, and the primary vote, the whole period was down around in the mid-30s. And, that didn't seem to really ever sort of penetrate to the LNP party room. You can't fatten the pig on market day. You have to work hard and diligently through that period of opposition and present your policies and plans and have them totally worked out and have taken the government down as you go. And I don't know why, Alan, but a little bird told me in the last 24 hours that the the party room may have been misled by the leadership team, that they were told, I'm told that the party room are told that they were going to win 13 seats, that the polling said that. Maybe explains why all those LNP MPs just thought they somehow were going to walk into office.
That's Campbell Newman, the former Queensland Premier, speaking to Alan Jones on his Sky News program this week. Before coronavirus, there was little hope for Palaszczuk, who'd presided over the biggest and most expensive public service per capita of any state in Australia. A lot of fat bureaucrats. By far the biggest debt of any state in Australia, about to top $120 billion post-coronavirus rescue packages, rising crime, and the demise of her deputy Jackie Trad. Queensland was ripe to turn blue again, but it didn't. Pundits have proposed a number of reasons other than what Campbell Newman's just mentioned. It's highly unlikely that any one reason is to blame, but it was a multi-factor defeat. First of all, incumbency and crisis. When there's a crisis, people like to vote for the incumbent known safe-sitting government. Change just isn't popular during war times. Number two, fear and the border closures. While there were some horrible missteps from Palaszczuk that were very unpopular regarding sick people being denied access to Queensland and relatives not being allowed to attend funerals, Queenslanders generally supported Palaszczuk's border closures, despite experts saying that after a while they were generally completely unnecessary and unhelpful and clearly only in place for political reasons. Queenslanders are tribal and parochial, and Palaszczuk played them like a fiddle on that score. Number three, low COVID cases in Queensland. So far. Palaszczuk took advantage of her hyper-safe approach and her good luck and sold the low cases as her doing. Frecklington, the opposition leader, meanwhile failed to tell any kind of story about opening borders safely. She allowed Palaszczuk to frame the debate as an either-or thing. It's either economy or people's health. And she just wasn't strategic or clever about managing the challenge of going on the attack with a leader who was looking good in a crisis. In fact, she didn't even seem to want to play the game. While the state was obsessed with COVID, Deb was out announcing infrastructure projects. Bad move. As Campbell Newman pointed out to Alan Jones, there is a way to manage when you're up against a leader who's looking good in a crisis. You've just got to come up with a better narrative. But you've got to come up with one, and you've got to deliver it firmly.
Well, in the end, they were astride the barbed wire fence because the Labor Party used this, Frecklington calling for the border to be open 67 times against her in the election. Early in the piece, the LNP could have and should have said, right, this is going to be an issue because by April, the Premier's popularity was soaring, and that was in the polls, the public polls, and they needed to deal with COVID. And I guess what I'm saying this evening is COVID-19 is undoubtedly a factor in this election, but it should never be an excuse because if we want to talk about the future, Alan, that's probably more productive. They need to accept what went wrong. They need to then take the necessary actions. They need to get the teamwork going under new leadership, and they need to work damn hard from this moment forward.
There were some good results on the LNP side. I mean, this 29-year-old Sam O'Connor, who holds the seat of Bonnie on the Gold Coast, had a swing towards him of 11%. I mean, David Crisafulli, who's going to be the new leader, had a swing of 11.6%.
Because they work damn hard. Sadly, within the LNP party room, there are people who are seat warmers.
Right.
They need to have a long, hard look at themselves.
Absolutely.
And actually, they should make way for new talent, new blood. It's time for generational change.
That's Campbell Newman, former Queensland Premier, speaking to Alan Jones on his Sky News program this week. Deb Frecklington never got traction. Her brand awareness was non-existent until just a few weeks before the election, and she took a long time to find her stride. She performed better in the last 2 weeks, but she came off then as lacking in authenticity. People just didn't take to her. But you can't just blame Deb Frecklington for everything. Other senior members in the frontbench lineup have to take responsibility as well. One of those is the deputy leader, Tim Mander, who's still in place, but shouldn't be after the party room meeting that will follow the declaration, where a new leader, David Crisafulli, will be elected. One of the most scathing editorials of the week came from Stephen Wardle, the state political editor of the Courier Mail newspaper. Wardle writes, If these MPs really want to know why they've been trounced again, why they'll spend the next 4 years wallowing in opposition, they all, with few exceptions, only need to look in the mirror for the answer. From front bench to back bench, the LNP is beset by a bunch of lazy, incompetent and irrelevant members who are clueless about the hard work required to beat Labor at a Queensland election. It's brutal stuff, but there really does need to be a clean out and a generational reset, it seems. And that brings us to the end of yet another episode of The Other Side Australia. I'm Damien Curry. Look forward to having your company again next week. We will be uploading Friday morning, as always, and we'll have more for you on the situation in the United States, as well as all of the best conservative and classical liberal commentary from here at home. See you then.